On the morning of May 15, 1862, this beautiful view overlooking the James River 8 miles downstream of Richmond, Virginia, was filled with smoke and thunder as two of the U.S. Navy's first ironclads attempted to silence the Confederate batteries guarding this bend in the river. One of them, USS Monitor, is remembered as the ship that introduced the revolving turret to naval combat when she fought CSS Virginia in the first battle between ironclads just 2 months before. The other, USS Galena, was perhaps just as experimental, if nowhere near as innovative as USS Monitor. However, in her first voyage from Connecticut, Virginia, she rolled badly, and the sailing rig was removed for duty on the rivers. She carried 4 9-inch Dahlgrens on broadside carriages, 2 per side. Her 2 100-pounder Parrott rifles were on pivot mountings, 1 fore and 1 aft, meaning she could bring 2 9-inch Dahlgrens and both 100-pounder Parrotts to bear on either broadside. One of the 100-pounder Parrotts, U.S. Navy No. 10, survives in a cemetery in Newmanstown, Pennsylvania. Many thanks to friend of the page James Murray for traveling to take photos of No. 10. Her wooden hull had considerable tumble home above the waterline. An illustration in the April 19, 1862 issue of Scientific American shows how the ship's armor was mounted on the wooden hull. The armor was about 3 inches thick and consisted of interlocking iron bars. The same article notes the armor was not thick enough to stop heavy solid shot. Instead, the purpose was to prevent explosive shells from being able to penetrate the ship and detonate inside. On May 8, 1862, Galena suppressed the fire of 2 Confederate earthworks batteries on the James River, for Forts Boykin and Huger. She didn't take any damage in those fights, and may not have even been hit. Meanwhile, back in Hampton Roads, a U.S. Navy squadron consisting of USS Monitor, USS Susquehanna, USS Seminole, USS San Jacinto, and USS Dakota, along with the revenue cutter E.A. Stevens, bombarded Confederate batteries at Sewell's Point, under the direct observation of President Lincoln, who was nearby aboard a steam tug. The goal had been to draw out CSS Virginia and engage the Confederate ironclad. Virginia came out, prepared for action, but Flag Officer Tatnall wanted to fight his ship with the assistance of the guns at Sewell's Point, and the U.S. Navy wanted to draw Virginia out away from those batteries, which Virginia wouldn't do. So no battle was fought between the ironclads. E.A. Stevens, generally called in Navy communications Naugatuck, was a curious vessel. She was iron-hulled and had the ability to flood tanks and reduce the amount of her hull vulnerable to shot. She mounted a single 100-pounder Parrott rifle, U.S. Army Registry No. 1. She was not a Navy vessel, but belonged to the Treasury Department's Revenue Service, one of the predecessors of the United States Coast Guard. Despite the inconclusive action on the 8th, things would begin to move quickly. General Huger, in command of the Confederate troops in the Norfolk area, evacuated on May 10th, leaving CSS Virginia without a base of support. Commodore Tatnall attempted to have CSS Virginia lightened enough to ascend the James River, but the river was too low and the ironclad's draft too deep, forcing the Confederates to destroy the vessel on May 11th. Without CSS Virginia, there was little to stop the U.S. Navy from steaming up the James River all the way to Richmond. It had only been a matter of days since Farragut's squadron on the Mississippi had forced their way past the defenses downstream of New Orleans and taken the city. There was now every possibility that the fleet at Hampton Roads might be used directly against Richmond. Even if Richmond did not surrender at the mere threat of naval bombardment, as had New Orleans, with the U.S. Navy in control of the James and McClellan's army pushing up the peninsula, the Confederate capital would be in an extremely perilous position. Having just lost one of the South's most significant industrial centers at New Orleans, losing Richmond with both the Tredegar and Bologna foundries would almost surely doom the Confederacy. In the preceding days, the Confederates rushed to reinforce the battery on the James River at Drewry's Bluff, a point which sits about 100 feet above a bend in the James River. Robert E. Lee, not yet in command of the Army of Northern Virginia, ordered a 10-inch Columbiad added to the Drewry's Bluff battery, which was named Fort Darling, and by May 10th, Lee reported to General Johnson that several Navy guns had been added to the defenses. Perhaps most significantly, a line of obstructions was placed in the river just downstream of the fort, including steamships which had been sunk to block the channel. Galena, Monitor, E.A. Stevens, Aroostook, and Port Royal moved up the river. And on the morning of May 15th, the Confederates in the fort watched as the U.S. Navy squadron slowly steamed into range of the fort. Commander Rodgers found the passage blocked by the sunken ships and obstructions. He wrote later, "The banks of the river we found lined with rifle pits, from which sharpshooters annoyed the men at the guns. These would hinder the removal of obstructions unless driven away by a land force. The Galena ran within about 600 yards of the battery, as near as the obstructions as it was deemed proper to go. She let go her anchor and with a spring swung across the stream, not more than twice as wide as the ship is long. Then at 7:45 a.m. opened fire upon the battery. The wooden vessels, as directed, anchored about 1,300 yards below. The Monitor anchored near, and at 9 o'clock she passed just above the Galena, but found her guns could not be elevated enough to reach the battery. She then dropped a little below us and made her shots effective. For the next 3 hours, the ships of the U.S. Navy exchanged fire with the Confederate positions ashore and afloat aboard CSS Patrick Henry, all the while being pelted by small arms fire from rifle pits along the banks, manned by Confederate Marines, sailors, and soldiers. Some 40 years after the battle, a gentleman named Samuel Mann, who had been a sergeant at Fort Darling, wrote, "When the first broadside of 4 shells from the Galena passed just over the crest of our parapets and exploded in our rear, scattering their fragments in every direction, together with the sounds of the shells from the others, which flew wide of the mark, mingled with the roar of the guns, was the most startling, terrifying, and diabolical sound which I had ever heard or ever expected to hear again. The most powerful gun ashore, a 10-inch Columbiad mounted at Fort Darling, was disabled in its first discharge. Sergeant Mann wrote that he had assumed that the Columbiad had been fired with its carriage out of gear, but following the battle, he and his fellow soldiers came to the conclusion that the gun had been accidentally double-loaded. With their heaviest gun out of action at the very beginning of the battle, the Confederate gunners concentrated on Galena. USS Monitor was barely targeted at all, possibly because the Confederates realized that if the 9-inch Dahlgrens of CSS Virginia had been ineffective at close range, the 8-inch Columbiads in the fort were not likely to be effective at 1,000 yards. With the 10-inch Columbiad out of action, it was the 8-inch Columbiads that bore the brunt of the fighting with the Federal fleet. While turning broadside to the fort enabled Galena to bring most of her guns to bear, it also meant the descending shot struck the thinly armored and gently sloped hull at almost a perfect perpendicular angle. Shot after shot struck the hull and penetrated the armor. Even some shells managed to do the same and detonated inside the ship, causing both damage to the vessel and casualties among the crew. One gun's crew had to be replaced twice, as each preceding crew had become casualties. Coal heavers were brought up on deck to join the gun crews to replace those who had been struck. Commander Rodgers stressed that the entire ship's complement behaved extremely well. Rodgers singled out for a particular phrase Charles Kenyon, a fireman who was consistent for persistent courage in extracting a priming wire which had become bent and fixed in the bow gun, and in returning to work the piece after his hands, severely burned, had been roughly dressed by himself with cotton waste and oil. And Jeremiah Reagan, quartermaster and captain of No. 2 gun, who Rodgers recommended for promotion after the battle to master's mate. Both Kenyon and Reagan would receive the Medal of Honor, along with Marine Corporal John F. Mackey, whose citation reads, "On board the USS Galena in the attack on Fort Darling at Drewry's Bluff, James River, May 15, 1862, as enemy shellfire raked the deck of his ship, Corporal Mackey fearlessly maintained his musket fire against the rifle pits along the shore when ordered to fill vacancies at guns caused by men wounded and killed in action, manned the weapon with skill and courage. Corporal Mackey is recognized as the first Marine to receive the Medal of Honor. As such, he is the subject of a near life-size display of a portion of Galena's hull at the National Museum of the Marine Corps. If you've not been to the museum in Quantico, Virginia, please go. USS Monitor, once positioned far enough away to be able to fire its guns at the fort, kept up a steady fire. She was only struck 3 times, without damage save for small dents. I recently got to glimpse USS Monitor's turret under conservation at the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia, another museum that I cannot recommend highly enough. E.A. Stevens fired on Fort Darling until her 100-pounder Parrott burst on its 17th round. According to Mike Ryan's study on bursting Parrotts, this was U.S. Army 100-pounder Parrott Registry No. 1. After this, the revenue cutter engaged infantry ashore with its boat howitzers. The wooden gunboats USS Aroostook and USS Port Royal fired at longer range. Both were hit a few times, though without taking significant damage or casualties. Aboard Galena, 13 men were killed and 11 wounded, 1 mortally. According to Sergeant Mann, 7 Confederates were killed, along with others wounded. By 11 a.m., USS Galena had expended nearly all of her ammunition, being reduced to just 6 charges for her 100-pounders and having run out of filled 9-inch shells. Commander Rodgers ordered that the U.S. Navy squadron withdraw and retreat downriver. The battle was over. Fort Darling at Drewry's Bluff would remain in Confederate hands until very near the end of the war, being significantly strengthened over the years. Photos taken in 1865 show multiple 10-inch Columbiads and at least 1 Brooke rifle. Other batteries of heavy guns would be built along the James, and the Confederate Navy's James River Squadron would commission 3 ironclads. Never again during the war would the U.S. Navy get so close to Richmond. Although Commander Rodgers recommended that the Galena be sent to the Navy Yard at Washington, in part so that ordnance officers like John Dahlgren could examine the effect that the shot had on her armor, she was too valuable a ship to spare. Indeed, Flag Officer Goldsborough and Secretary Wells pondered sending the damaged Galena along with USS Monitor on an expedition against Wilmington. However, she was soon needed for more operations on the James River to support the U.S. Army. Galena took an active role in the Battle of Malvern Hill. At the beginning of the battle, General McClellan was actually aboard Galena, something that he would be criticized for later. On June 30th and July 1st, Galena would take Confederate troops directly under fire with her main battery guns. Galena is often strongly condemned for the dismal performance of her armor. Commander Rodgers wrote in his report of the battle on May 16th, "The result of our experiment with Galena I enclose. We demonstrated that she is not shot-proof. Balls came through, and many men were killed with fragments of her own iron." However, it's notable that Galena took the damage that she did and didn't withdraw from the fight until she had emptied her magazines at the fort. She continued serving actively for the next months. While Rodgers was critical of Galena, he also wrote that no wooden gunboat of the same size could have taken the pounding that she did and remain in action. She would stay in Virginia waters until May of 1863, when finally enough ironclads had joined the fleet that she could be taken out of service for a refit. During the refit at Philadelphia, most of her armor was removed, save for some around her boilers and machinery, but her battery was also almost doubled. She was given a 3-masted sailing rig, and she was dispatched to the West Gulf blockading squadron. She joined Farragut's fleet and took part in the Battle of Mobile Bay. Being lashed to USS Oneida, the 2 vessels were last in the U.S. Navy line, passing the forts. 4 of her crew would receive the Medal of Honor for their actions during the battle, in which their ship was struck several times by 10-inch shot fired by the forts. Galena would not see active service again following the war. In 1872, she was broken up and a new ship built in her place using the Navy's repair budget. So what can still be seen from the Battle of Drewry's Bluff? U.S. Navy 100-pounder Parrott rifle number 10 is in a cemetery in Newmanstown, Pennsylvania. It was one of Galena's two 100-pounder Parrotts, which fired nearly all of their ammunition during the battle. Unusually, it is marked in a mix of Navy and Army styles. It has some of its markings on top of its barrel band, as is practice in the Navy, but some of its markings on its muzzle. Again, many thanks to James Murray for these photos. USS Monitor, of course, would sink at the end of 1862 off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. Much from the ship, including her turret, her guns, her engine and propeller, have been raised and are under conservation or on display at the Mariners Museum, along with many thousands of other small artifacts from the ship. Please visit the Monitor Center at the Mariners Museum. It is incredible. And there's Drewry's Bluff itself. Part of the Richmond National Battlefield Park, the site is directly adjacent to I-95 south of Richmond. Once in the parking lot, be aware that you do have a walk of nearly a mile to reach the fort, but it's well worth it, and the trail is very easy and paved much of the way. Displayed at the fort is an 8-inch Confederate Columbiad number 66, which was cast by Bologna Foundry just a few miles away in 1862. From what I understand, this Columbiad was left at the fort following the war. Given that Sergeant Mann's account specifically mentions that the Columbiads during the battle were Bologna manufactured, it makes me wonder if this very Columbiad may have been present there on May 15th in action against Galena and Monitor. If anyone has done research into this, I'd love to hear it. Hey, I'm Santee 1821. I tell stories of the U.S. Navy during the 19th century. Follow me for more.